A widowed woman named Rebecca brings gifts to an orphanage and is stunned to see a black boy who looks exactly like her late husband. The resemblance is undeniable, but how could this be possible? As Rebecca digs deeper into the mystery, she uncovers a shocking truth that could change her life forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Rebecca Davis stood in front of her closet, her fingers gently brushing over the soft fabric of her favorite blue sweater. It was the one John had given her on their last Christmas together. A small smile tugged at her lips as she remembered his warm embrace and the twinkle in his eyes when she'd opened the gift. "This will do," she whispered to herself, pulling the sweater off its hanger. As she dressed for her visit to the orphanage, Rebecca's gaze drifted to the framed photo on her nightstand. John's kind face beamed back at her, and she felt a familiar ache in her chest. It had been 2 years since he passed, but the pain still felt fresh some days. Rebecca shook her head gently, trying to push away the sadness. Today wasn't about her grief. It was about bringing joy to the children who needed it most. She had always loved kids, and her work at the orphanage gave her a sense of purpose that helped fill the void John's death had left behind. In the living room, colorful gift bags were neatly arranged on the coffee table. Rebecca had spent weeks carefully selecting presents for each child. There were soft teddy bears for the little ones, art supplies for the creative minds, and books for the avid readers. Each gift was chosen with love and wrapped with care. As she placed the last present in her car, Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest. She knew John would be proud of her for continuing their tradition of giving back to the community. It was something they had always done together, and carrying on this legacy helped her feel connected to him. Driving to the orphanage, Rebecca hummed along to the mellow music playing, but instead of letting the memories overwhelm her, she channeled her emotions into excitement for the day ahead. "These kids deserve all the love in the world," Rebecca said softly to herself as she pulled into the orphanage parking lot. "And if I can bring them even a moment of happiness, then that's what matters most." With a deep breath and a determined smile, Rebecca gathered the gifts from her car. The weight of the bags in her arms felt like a comforting embrace, reminding her of the joy she was about to spread. As she walked towards the entrance, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Rebecca stepped into the orphanage, her arms laden with colorful gift bags. The familiar scent of pine and cinnamon greeted her, along with the warm smiles of the staff. "Rebecca, it's so good to see you," Ms. Santos, the head caretaker, exclaimed, rushing over to help with the bags. "The children have been so excited for your visit." Rebecca felt a surge of warmth in her chest. "I'm happy to be here," she replied, her voice soft but genuine. "How are the little ones doing?" As Ms. Santos updated her on the children's progress, Rebecca's eyes scanned the room. Excited faces peered at her from all corners, eyes wide with anticipation. She couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. With a nod to Ms. Santos, Rebecca began handing out the gifts. The room filled with the sound of tearing paper and delighted gasps. A little girl hugged a plush unicorn to her chest, while a boy nearby marveled at a shiny toy car. "Thank you, Miss Rebecca," voices chorused around her, each expression of gratitude warming her heart. As she moved through the room, Rebecca felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was why she came here year after year. The joy on these children's faces was a balm to her soul, helping to ease the ache of her own loss. But then, something changed. Rebecca's gaze fell on a young boy sitting quietly in the corner. He was small for his age, with deep brown skin and eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom beyond his years. Unlike the other children, he wasn't clamoring for attention or a gift. Instead, he watched the scene before him with a calm curiosity. Rebecca felt an unexpected tug in her chest. There was something about this boy that called to her, a connection she couldn't explain. She found herself moving towards him, drawn by an invisible force. As she got closer, the boy's eyes met hers. In that moment, Rebecca felt as if the world around her had faded away. There was a familiarity in those eyes, a depth that stirred something within her. "Hello there," Rebecca said softly, kneeling down to his level. "I'm Rebecca. What's your name?" The boy hesitated for a moment before answering in a quiet voice. James. It's nice to meet you, James, Rebecca smiled, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't understand. She held out a gift bag to him. I have something for you. James reached out tentatively, his small hand brushing against hers as he took the bag. The touch sent a jolt through Rebecca, intensifying the strange connection she felt. As James carefully opened his gift, Rebecca found herself unable to look away. There was something about this quiet, thoughtful boy that captivated her, a mystery she felt compelled to unravel. As James carefully unwrapped his gift, Rebecca couldn't help but study his face. There was something hauntingly familiar about his features, especially his eyes. Those deep, soulful eyes that seemed to look right into her heart. Suddenly, Rebecca felt as if she'd been struck by lightning. Those eyes, they were John's eyes. The same warm brown color, the same gentle curve, even the same way of looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. It was as if her beloved husband was staring back at her through this young boy's face. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat, and she felt her hands begin to tremble. How could this be possible? John had never mentioned having a child, and yet the resemblance was undeniable. She found herself searching James's face for other similarities, the shape of his nose, the curve of his cheek, the set of his jaw. With each passing moment, the likeness became more apparent, and Rebecca's heart raced with a mixture of confusion, hope, and fear. Memories of John flooded her mind, his laugh, his smile, the way he'd look at her with such love. For a moment, Rebecca felt as if she might collapse under the weight of her emotions. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she had to take a deep breath to steady herself. But as James looked up at her, his eyes wide with wonder at the toy train he'd just unwrapped, Rebecca forced herself to push her tumultuous thoughts aside. This wasn't the time or place to unravel this mystery. She had a job to do, children to care for, and she couldn't let her personal feelings overwhelm her. With a gentle smile that belied her inner turmoil, Rebecca helped James set up his new train. "Do you like trains, James?" she asked, her voice only slightly shaky. James nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've never had one before," he said softly. Rebecca's heart ached at his words, but she kept her tone light. "Well, then we'll have to make sure you have lots of fun with this one. Shall we see how fast it can go?" As she played with James, Rebecca tried to focus on the present moment, on bringing joy to this little boy. But in the back of her mind, questions swirled like a gathering storm. Who was James, really? And why did he look so much like her John? Rebecca tried her best to focus on the other children, but her eyes kept drifting back to James. The little boy sat quietly with his new train, carefully examining each part before setting it on the tracks. His thoughtful manner reminded her so much of John that it made her heart ache. Unable to resist any longer, Rebecca made her way back to James. She knelt down beside him, her voice soft and gentle. "May I join you?" James looked up, his brown eyes wide with surprise. He nodded shyly, scooting over to make room for her. "I see you're taking good care of your train," Rebecca said, picking up one of the carriages. "Do you like it?" James nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's nice," he said softly. "Thank you." Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "You're very welcome, James. I'm glad you like it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the train make its way around the track. Rebecca couldn't help but notice how James's small hands moved with care and precision, just like John's had when he worked on his projects. "Do you like other toys too?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep her voice steady. James looked up at her, his eyes curious. "I like books," he said, "and puzzles." Rebecca smiled, remembering how John had always loved a good puzzle. "Those are wonderful things to like," she said. "What kind of books do you enjoy?" As James began to talk about his favorite stories, Rebecca felt herself drawn in by his quiet enthusiasm. There was something so familiar about the way he spoke, the way his eyes lit up when he described a particularly exciting part of a book. With each passing moment, Rebecca felt a connection growing between them. It was as if an invisible thread linked their hearts, pulling them closer together. She found herself hanging on James's every word, treasuring each small smile and gesture. As they talked, Rebecca's earlier shock and confusion began to melt away, replaced by a warm, protective feeling. Whatever the explanation for James's resemblance to John might be, Rebecca knew one thing for certain. This little boy had captured her heart. Rebecca reluctantly left James's side, her mind swirling with questions. She approached Ms. Santos, the head caretaker, who was tidying up some toys nearby. "Excuse me, Ms. Santos," Rebecca said softly. "I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about James's background." Ms. Santos looked up, a gentle smile on her face. "Of course, Mrs. Davis. James has been with us since he was just a baby. Poor little thing was only a few weeks old when he arrived." Rebecca's heart clenched at the thought. "That's so young. Do you know what happened to his parents?" The caretaker's face grew somber. "It's a sad story, I'm afraid. His mother passed away shortly after he was born. A relative brought him to us, saying they couldn't care for him." Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. "That must have been so hard for him," she murmured, glancing back at James, who was still playing quietly with his train. Miss Santos nodded. "It's been tough, but James is a resilient boy. He's quiet, but he's got a big heart." "What about his father?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was there any information about him?" The caretaker shook her head. "I'm afraid not. The relative who brought James in didn't provide much information. We don't even know his father's name." Rebecca's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be possible that John? No, she told herself. It couldn't be. But the resemblance was so strong, and the timing. "Has anyone ever come looking for him?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, dear," Ms. Santos replied. "James has been here all this time, waiting for a family to call his own." Rebecca's heart ached for the little boy. She felt an overwhelming urge to protect him, to give him the love and family he deserved. But she also knew she needed to understand more about his past. "Is there any way to find out more about his background?" Rebecca asked. "Any records or information from when he was brought in?" Ms. Santos thought for a moment. "We do have his file in the office. It doesn't contain much, but you're welcome to take a look if you'd like. You've been such a dedicated supporter of our orphanage, Mrs. Davis. I trust you." Rebecca nodded gratefully, her heart pounding. "Yes, please, I'd very much like to see it." Rebecca returned home that evening, her mind consumed by thoughts of James. The little boy's face, so hauntingly familiar, seemed to follow her everywhere. She barely slept that night, tossing and turning as questions swirled in her head. The next morning, Rebecca found herself digging through old photo albums, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the pages. Each picture of John brought a fresh wave of emotions: love, grief, and now, confusion. She paused at a photo of John from his college days. His warm brown eyes, crinkled at the corners from laughter, stared back at her. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Those were James's eyes, without a doubt. "It can't be," she whispered to herself, but the seed of possibility had already taken root. Throughout the day, Rebecca found herself comparing every detail she could remember about James to the photos of John. The shape of their noses, the curve of their smiles, even the way James had tilted his head when he was thinking. It all reminded her of John. As evening fell, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photos and memories. Her emotions were a tangled mess. Part of her wanted to push these thoughts away, to chalk it up to coincidence and her own grief playing tricks on her mind. It would be easier, she thought, to just forget about it and move on with her life. But another part of her, a part that grew stronger with each passing hour, desperately needed to know the truth. What if James was somehow connected to John? What if this little boy, who had spent his whole life in an orphanage, was actually family? The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. If it were true, it would mean that a piece of John still lived on, that she hadn't lost everything when he died. But it would also mean that John had kept a huge secret from her, and that thought brought a fresh wave of pain. Rebecca's fingers traced the outline of John's face in a photo. "What aren't you telling me, John?" she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The next day, Rebecca found herself standing once again at the entrance of the orphanage, her heart pounding. In her hands, she clutched a small wrapped package, a special gift just for James. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The staff greeted her warmly, surprised but pleased by her quick return. Rebecca explained that she wanted to spend some more time with James, and they happily led her to where he was playing. James looked up as Rebecca approached, his eyes widening in recognition. A small, shy smile tugged at his lips. "Hello, Ms. Davis," he said softly. Rebecca's heart melted at his politeness. "Hello, James. I brought something for you." She held out the package, watching as curiosity sparked in his eyes. James carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a small, colorful book about animals. His face lit up with joy. "Thank you," he exclaimed, already flipping through the pages. As Rebecca sat down next to him, she couldn't help but notice how he held the book, fingers splayed across the cover, just like John used to do. It was such a small thing, but it made her breath catch. They spent the next hour looking through the book together. James pointed out his favorite animals, his excitement growing with each page. Rebecca found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing a book with a child. But as they talked, she couldn't ignore the growing list of similarities she noticed. The way James scrunched up his nose when he laughed, the thoughtful tilt of his head when he was concentrating, all of it reminded her so strongly of John. At one point, James looked up at her, his brown eyes serious. "Ms. Davis, why did you come back to see me?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. I felt a connection with you, James. I wanted to get to know you better." James nodded, seeming to accept this answer. He turned back to the book, but not before Rebecca caught a glimpse of hope in his eyes. It tugged at her heart, making her wonder once again about the possibility of a deeper connection between them. As their time together came to an end, Rebecca found herself reluctant to leave. The similarities she'd noticed felt too strong to be mere coincidence. She knew she couldn't ignore the growing certainty that there was more to James's story, and possibly her own, than she'd ever imagined. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at the orphanage with determination in her steps. She had spent a sleepless night thinking about James and the uncanny similarities he shared with John. She knew she needed answers. Ms. Rodriguez, the orphanage director, greeted Rebecca in her office. The older woman's face was kind but guarded as Rebecca took a seat across from her desk. "Ms. Davis, what can I do for you today?" Ms. Rodriguez asked, her tone polite but cautious. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I'd like to know more about James's background," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't explain it, but I feel a strong connection to him." Ms. Rodriguez's expression softened, but she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but we have strict privacy policies. I can't share personal information about our children." Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Please, Ms. Rodriguez, I understand the need for privacy, but I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. There's something about James that reminds me so much of my late husband. I just need to know if there's any possibility." Ms. Rodriguez studied Rebecca's face, seeming to weigh her options. After a long moment, she sighed. "I can see this means a lot to you, Ms. Davis. While I can't give you all the details, I suppose I can share a little bit." Rebecca's heart raced as Ms. Rodriguez opened a file on her desk. "James was brought to us as a newborn," she began. "His mother had passed away shortly after giving birth, and a relative brought him here." "Do you know anything about his mother?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Rodriguez hesitated. "Not much. She was young, in her early 20s. The relative who brought James in didn't provide many details. They said she had been living on her own and had kept her pregnancy a secret from her family." Rebecca's mind whirled with possibilities. And his father? "Unknown," Ms. Rodriguez said. "The relative claimed not to know anything about him." Rebecca left the orphanage with her mind racing. The little information Ms. Rodriguez had shared only fueled her determination to uncover the truth about James. She drove home, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. Once home, Rebecca headed straight for her study. She booted up her computer and began her search. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she looked into records of women who had lived in the area around the time James was born. She cross-referenced this information with what she knew about John's past relationships. Hours passed as Rebecca dug deeper and deeper. She barely noticed the sun setting outside her window, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Just as she was about to call it a night, a name caught her eye. Angela Thompson. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She remembered Angela, the woman John had been engaged to before they met. John had rarely spoken about her, but Rebecca knew their relationship had ended abruptly. With trembling hands, Rebecca clicked on Angela's record. Her eyes widened as she read the information. Angela had left town suddenly, right around the time James would have been born. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Rebecca sat back in her chair, her mind reeling from the implications of her discovery. Could it be possible? Was James the child of John and Angela? The thought made her heart race with a mix of excitement and fear. She looked at the clock, realizing it was well past midnight. Rebecca knew she needed to sleep, but her mind was too active. She promised herself she would dig deeper tomorrow to find out more about Angela and her connection to James. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca's thoughts were filled with images of James and John. The resemblance that had first caught her attention now seemed even more significant. She fell into a restless sleep, dreaming of family secrets and unexpected connections. Rebecca woke up early the next morning, her mind still swirling with thoughts of James and Angela. She sat at her kitchen table, clutching a mug of coffee, trying to make sense of it all. The possibility that James might be John's son sent waves of emotion crashing over her. "Oh, John," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Did you know? Did you have any idea?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she imagined John never knowing he had a son. The thought of James growing up without a father, without knowing his own history, made Rebecca's heart ache. She closed her eyes, remembering John's warm smile and kind eyes, the same eyes she had seen in James. The resemblance that had first caught her attention now felt like a sign, a message from beyond. Rebecca's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She wanted to call the orphanage right away, to see James again, to hug him and tell him everything. But fear held her back. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just a coincidence? She put the phone down and took a deep breath. "I need to be sure," she said to herself. "I can't rush into this. It's not fair to James or to John's memory." The thought of John made her pause. What would he have wanted? Rebecca could almost hear his voice, gentle and reassuring, telling her to follow her heart. She stood up, feeling a new sense of purpose. Rebecca knew she had to find out the truth, not just for herself, but for James and for John. She owed it to all of them to uncover the full story. As she got ready to continue her investigation, Rebecca's emotions swung between excitement and terror. The idea of having a part of John back in her life through James filled her with joy, but the fear of disrupting James's life, of possibly disappointing him or herself, weighed heavily on her heart. "One step at a time," Rebecca told herself, trying to stay calm. "We'll figure this out together, John. I promise." Rebecca sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her phone. She took a deep breath and dialed the number of Mark, one of John's oldest friends. As the phone rang, her heart raced with anticipation and nervousness. "Hello?" Mark's familiar voice answered. "Mark, it's Rebecca. I hope I'm not bothering you," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "Rebecca, of course not. It's great to hear from you. How are you doing?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment before diving in. "I'm okay, Mark, but I need to ask you about something. About John's past." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sure, Rebecca. What do you want to know?" "Do you remember Angela, the woman John was engaged to before me?" Mark's voice softened. "Yeah, I remember Angela. That was a tough time for John." Rebecca's grip tightened on the phone. "Can you tell me what happened?" Why did they break up? Mark sighed deeply. It was strange, Rebecca. One day they were happy and planning their wedding, and the next, Angela was just gone. She disappeared without a word. John was devastated. Rebecca's suspicions grew stronger with each word. Did John ever find out why she left? No, he never did. He tried to find her, but it was like she vanished into thin air. It took him a long time to get over it. Rebecca's mind raced, connecting the dots. The timing of Angela's disappearance, James's age, it all seemed to fit. But she knew she needed more than just coincidences. Mark, do you know if Angela ever contacted John after she left? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not that I know of. John would have told me if she had, Mark replied. Rebecca, what's this all about? Rebecca paused, unsure of how much to reveal. I'm just trying to understand some things about John's past. Thank you, Mark. You've been really helpful. After saying goodbye, Rebecca sat back in her chair, her mind whirling with new information. The confirmation of Angela's sudden disappearance and John's heartbreak only strengthened her suspicions about James, but she knew she couldn't jump to conclusions. She needed more concrete evidence. Rebecca paced her living room, her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination. She knew what she had to do next, but the thought of it made her stomach churn. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her car keys and headed to the orphanage. As she walked through the familiar halls, Rebecca rehearsed what she would say to Ms. Rodriguez. When she reached the director's office, she knocked softly on the door. Come in, Ms. Rodriguez called. Rebecca entered, her hands trembling slightly. Ms. Rodriguez, I need to talk to you about something important. The director looked up from her paperwork, concern etched on her face. Of course, Rebecca. What's on your mind? Rebecca sat down, her eyes meeting Ms. Rodriguez's. It's about James. I think he might be related to my late husband, John. Ms. Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up in surprise. What makes you think that? Rebecca explained her suspicions, detailing the resemblance and the information she had gathered about Angela. As she spoke, Ms. Rodriguez listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. When Rebecca finished, she took a deep breath and said, I know this is unusual, but I'd like to request a DNA test to determine if James is related to John. Ms. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. Rebecca, I understand your concerns, but this is a delicate situation. We have strict policies about the children's privacy and well-being. I know, Rebecca said, her voice pleading, but if James is John's son, he deserves to know about his family, and I need to know the truth. Ms. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, considering Rebecca's words. This is not a decision I can make lightly, she said finally. There are many factors to consider, including James's emotional well-being. Rebecca nodded, understanding the weight of her request. I know it's a lot to ask, but please, Ms. Rodriguez, this could change James's life, and mine, for the better. After a long pause, Ms. Rodriguez sighed. I can see how important this is to you, Rebecca. And if there's a chance that James has family out there, we owe it to him to find out. She leaned forward, her expression serious. I'll help you arrange the test, but we need to handle this carefully. Relief washed over Rebecca, and tears welled up in her eyes. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make sure James is protected through this process. As Rebecca waited for the DNA results, she found herself lost in memories of her life with John. She sat in their favorite armchair, a photo album open on her lap, tracing the outline of John's face with her finger. Their wedding day smiled up at her from the pages. Rebecca's heart ached as she remembered how handsome John had looked in his tuxedo, his eyes sparkling with joy and love. She could almost hear his deep, warm laugh echoing through their home. Oh, John, she whispered, her voice catching. We had so many plans. Rebecca turned the page, revealing pictures of their honeymoon. They had dreamed of starting a family, of filling their home with the patter of little feet and the sound of children's laughter. But time had slipped away from them, and now... She closed her eyes, letting the grief wash over her. It had been 2 years since John's passing. but the pain still felt fresh some days. Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. As she opened her eyes, they fell on a picture of John holding his nephew. The way he looked at the child with such tenderness and love made Rebecca's heart clench. John would have been an amazing father. Suddenly, James's face flashed in her mind. Those familiar eyes, so much like John's, filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Rebecca felt a surge of emotion, grief for what she had lost, hope for what might be. "If James is your son, John," Rebecca said softly, "maybe a part of you is still here. Maybe we can still have the family we dreamed of." The thought both thrilled and terrified her. What if the test came back negative? The disappointment would be crushing, but if it was positive? Rebecca's mind raced with possibilities. She imagined teaching James about his father, sharing stories and memories. She could picture herself tucking him into bed at night, reading him the same stories John had loved as a child. The thought brought a bittersweet smile to her face. As the days passed, Rebecca found herself alternating between hope and anxiety. Every time the phone rang, her heart leaped, thinking it might be the orphanage with news. The waiting was almost unbearable, but it also gave her time to prepare herself for whatever the results might be. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Rebecca's hands trembled as she answered the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. Ms. Rodriguez's voice was gentle but firm as she delivered the news. The DNA test confirmed it. James was John's son. Rebecca sank into her chair, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Tears streamed down her face as she thanked Ms. Rodriguez and hung up the phone. She sat there, stunned, as the reality of the situation washed over her. "Oh, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You had a son. You had a son, and you never knew." The joy of discovering a living piece of John was tempered by the crushing realization that he had missed out on knowing his own child. Rebecca's heart ached for both John and James, imagining all the moments they should have shared. As the initial shock subsided, Rebecca felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over her. James had been alone all this time, living without the love of a family. The thought of him spending even one more day in the orphanage made her chest tighten with urgency. "I have to do something," she said to herself, wiping away tears. "I have to be there for him." But fear crept in alongside her determination. Taking in a child, becoming a mother overnight. It was a daunting prospect. Rebecca had always imagined starting a family with John by her side. Now she faced the possibility of raising his son alone. "Can I do this?" she wondered aloud, her voice shaky. "Am I ready for such a big change?" Rebecca's mind raced with questions and concerns. How would she explain everything to James? Would he want to live with her? Could she provide the love and support he needed? Despite her fears, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this was meant to be. James was a part of John, a living legacy of the man she had loved so deeply. She knew in her heart that she couldn't turn away from him. The next day, Rebecca's hands shook as she walked up the steps to the orphanage. Her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before entering. Ms. Rodriguez was waiting for her in the office, a look of concern on her face. "Rebecca, how are you?" she asked gently. "I'm okay now, but I feel like I need to do something. For John, for James." She responded, wiping her eyes. "I know. It's overwhelming. What do you want to do now?" Ms. Rodriguez asked, leaning forward. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I want to adopt James," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He's John's son. He's family. I can't bear the thought of him staying here when he has a home waiting for him." Ms. Rodriguez smiled warmly. "I think that's wonderful, Rebecca. It won't be easy, but I believe you have so much love to give." "I'm scared," Rebecca admitted. "I never thought I'd be a mother like this. But when I look at James, I see John. I see a chance to honor his memory and give his son the love he deserves." Ms. Rodriguez reached out and squeezed Rebecca's hand. "You won't be alone in this. We'll help you every step of the way." Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you," she said, grateful for the support. "Would you like to see James now?" Ms. Rodriguez asked. Rebecca nodded, her heart racing again. As they walked to the playroom, she thought about how her life was about to change. It was a big step, but in her heart, she knew it was the right thing to do. Rebecca began the adoption process with determination, her heart set on bringing James into her family. She spent hours filling out paperwork, her hand cramping as she wrote page after page of information. The legal jargon made her head spin, but she pressed on, knowing that each form brought her closer to James. As news of her decision spread, Rebecca faced unexpected opposition from her family. Her sister, Sarah, called one evening, her voice filled with concern. "Rebecca, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. "Raising a child is a huge responsibility. You've been through so much already." Rebecca sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and understanding. "I know it won't be easy, Sarah. But James needs a family, and I need him. He's a part of John." Despite her sister's worries, Rebecca refused to be swayed. She threw herself into preparing for James's arrival, transforming her spare room into a cozy bedroom filled with toys and books. The adoption process dragged on, each day feeling longer than the last. Rebecca visited James at the orphanage as often as she could, their bond growing stronger with each meeting. She loved watching his shy smile bloom into laughter as they played together. One afternoon, as Rebecca was leaving the orphanage, Ms. Rodriguez pulled her aside. "There's been a complication with the paperwork," she said softly. "We need to provide more documentation about James's background." Rebecca's heart sank. She had hoped the process would be smoother, but she squared her shoulders, ready to face this new challenge. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Ms. Rodriguez responded, "We'll help you and we'll figure this out. I'll keep you posted." As she drove home that day, Rebecca felt a mix of emotions. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal hurdles and family concerns. But when she thought of James's smile, she knew in her heart that every struggle would be worth it. She was ready to fight for the family she and James both deserved. As the adoption process inched forward, Rebecca found herself spending more and more time with James. She visited the orphanage several times a week, her heart lifting each time she saw his shy smile. On one sunny afternoon, Rebecca brought a colorful picture book to share with James. They sat together on a worn couch in the orphanage's playroom. James nestled close to her side. "Would you like to read with me?" Rebecca asked gently. James nodded, his eyes bright with curiosity. As Rebecca began to read, her voice soft and warm, James leaned in closer, pointing at the vibrant illustrations. "Look at the big elephant," he exclaimed, his usual reserve melting away. Rebecca chuckled, feeling a surge of affection. "Yes, it's huge. What do you think it's doing?" As they continued through the book, James grew more animated, asking questions and sharing his thoughts. Rebecca marveled at how quickly he was opening up to her. Their visits became a cherished routine. Sometimes they read books, other times they played board games or simply talked. James began to look forward to Rebecca's visits, his face lighting up when she walked through the door. One day, as they were coloring together, James looked up at Rebecca with his soulful eyes. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked hesitantly. Rebecca's heart melted. "Of course I will," she assured him. "I love spending time with you." James smiled, a rare, full smile that made Rebecca's breath catch. In that moment, she saw not just John's features, but a unique little boy who was carving out a special place in her heart. As weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. James began to see Rebecca not just as a kind visitor, but as a friend. He shared his dreams with her, his fears, and even his favorite jokes. Rebecca treasured these moments, each one a step closer to the family they both longed for. The adoption process might be slow and challenging, but the connection they were building was real and precious. As Rebecca's bond with James grew stronger, a nagging sense of guilt began to weigh heavily on her heart. Late one evening, after tucking James in at the orphanage, she found herself sitting in Ms. Rodriguez's office, her emotions threatening to overflow. "I can't help but wonder," Rebecca said softly, her voice quivering. What if I had known about James sooner? John never got to meet his son, never got to hold him or watch him grow. Ms. Rodriguez listened patiently, her kind eyes fixed on Rebecca's troubled face. And John, Rebecca continued, tears welling up. What would he think? Would he be upset that he missed out on James's life? Would he blame me for not finding out earlier? Ms. Rodriguez leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on Rebecca's arm. Rebecca, you can't blame yourself for things that were out of your control. John would understand that. Rebecca wiped away a tear. But I feel like I've failed them both somehow. James has been here all this time, and I never knew. Life doesn't always unfold the way we expect it to, Ms. Rodriguez said gently. What matters now is that you're here for James, and you're giving him the love and family he's always needed. Rebecca nodded, trying to take in the words of comfort. I just wish I could make up for lost time. You are, Ms. Rodriguez assured her. Every moment you spend with James, every smile you bring to his face, is healing the past. Focus on the present and the future you're building together. Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling some of the weight lift from her shoulders. Thank you, she said, managing a small smile. I guess I needed to hear that. Ms. Rodriguez squeezed her hand. You're doing a wonderful thing, Rebecca. James is lucky to have you, and I'm sure John would be proud of the love you're showing his son. As Rebecca left the office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The guilt wasn't entirely gone, but Ms. Rodriguez's words had given her strength. She would honor John's memory by giving James all the love she had, making every day count from now on. As the adoption process neared its completion, Rebecca threw herself into preparing her home for James's arrival. Her heart raced with excitement and nervous energy as she transformed the spare room into a cozy haven for her soon-to-be son. Rebecca carefully painted the walls a warm, sunny yellow, remembering how John had always said it was the color of happiness. She hung curtains with playful patterns and laid down a soft rug that James could sit on while reading or playing. With trembling hands, Rebecca placed framed photographs of John on the dresser and nightstand. She wanted James to feel connected to his father, to know the man who had unknowingly given him life. Tears pricked her eyes as she arranged the pictures, imagining how different things might have been if John were still alive. Oh, John, she whispered, touching one of the frames, I wish you could see him. He's so much like you. Rebecca filled the shelves with books, recalling the stories John had loved as a child. She carefully selected toys that she thought James might enjoy, picturing his face lighting up as he explored his new room. Each item she placed felt like a bridge between the past and the future she was building with James. As the days passed, Rebecca found her love for James growing deeper and stronger. She caught herself daydreaming about their life together, helping him with homework, celebrating birthdays, and creating new family traditions. In her heart, James was already her son. The night before James was set to come home, Rebecca sat on the edge of his new bed, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. Excitement bubbled up inside her at the thought of finally bringing James home, but anxiety crept in too. Would she be a good mother? Could she give James everything he needed? Rebecca took a deep breath, her eyes roaming over the room she had so lovingly prepared. It was more than just a space for James. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of love that transcended loss and time. As she sat there, surrounded by the promise of their future together, Rebecca felt a sense of peace settle over her. The day of the final adoption hearing arrived, and Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she entered the courthouse. She smoothed her dress nervously, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her purse. James walked beside her, his small hand in hers, his eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. As they sat in the courtroom, Rebecca couldn't help but steal glances at James. He looked so much like John it made her heart ache with both joy and sadness. She squeezed his hand gently, offering a reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, as much to herself as to James. The judge entered the room and Rebecca felt her breath catch in her throat. This was the moment that would change their lives forever. As the proceedings began, Rebecca listened intently, her mind racing with hopes and fears. The judge reviewed their case carefully, asking questions and considering all the details. Rebecca answered each query with honesty and conviction, her voice steady despite her nerves. She spoke of her love for James, her desire to give him a family, and the connection they shared through John. James, too, was asked a few simple questions. His shy, quiet responses brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. She could see how much he wanted this, how much he longed for a family to call his own. After what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up from his papers. Rebecca held her breath, her hand tightening around James's. After careful consideration, the judge began, "I am pleased to grant full custody of James to Rebecca Davis." The words washed over Rebecca like a warm wave. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she let out a small gasp of joy. She turned to James, who looked up at her with a mix of confusion and hope. "We did it, James," she said softly, pulling him into a gentle hug. "You're coming home with me, for good." As the reality of the moment sank in, Rebecca felt an overwhelming sense of relief and happiness. This was it, the beginning of their new life together. She looked at James, her son, and saw a future full of love and possibility. As Rebecca and James stepped into their new home together, a warm feeling of belonging washed over them both. Rebecca gently squeezed James's hand, looking down at him with a tender smile. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. James's eyes widened as he took in his surroundings. The cozy living room was filled with soft, comfortable furniture and warm colors. Photos of Rebecca and John adorned the walls, capturing happy moments from their life together. "Is this all for me?" James asked in a hushed voice, his gaze darting around the room. Rebecca nodded, her heart swelling with love. "Yes, James. This is your home now." She led him through the house, showing him each room with pride and excitement. When they reached James's bedroom, Rebecca opened the door with a flourish. Inside, a bright and cheerful space awaited, filled with toys, books, and a comfortable bed. James's face lit up with wonder. He rushed into the room, touching everything with careful reverence. Rebecca watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening with happy tears. As the days passed, James settled into his new life with surprising ease. He explored every nook and cranny of the house, asking questions about the photos and mementos he found. Rebecca answered patiently, sharing stories about John and their life together. One evening, as they sat together on the porch swing, James leaned against Rebecca's side. "Mom?" he said hesitantly, testing out the word. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, sweetie." "I'm really happy here," James said, his voice soft but sure. Rebecca wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. "I'm happy too, James. So very happy." As the sun set on another day in their new life together, Rebecca felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. She knew that this was exactly where they both belonged, and she was grateful for the love that had brought them together. As the days turned into weeks, Rebecca and James settled into a comfortable routine together. Each morning, they'd share breakfast at the kitchen table, James swinging his legs as he munched on his cereal, while Rebecca sipped her coffee and smiled at him over the rim of her mug. Their afternoons were filled with activities that brought them closer. Sometimes they'd curl up on the couch, Rebecca reading aloud from one of James's favorite books, his head resting against her shoulder. Other times they'd play board games or work on puzzles together, laughing and chatting as they bonded over shared challenges. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in the backyard, Rebecca knew it was time to have an important conversation with James. She took a deep breath, her heart racing with nervousness. "James, sweetheart," she began gently, "there's something very special I want to tell you about." James looked up at her, his eyes curious and trusting. Rebecca spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully as she explained about John being his father. She told him about the connection they shared and how she had discovered it. James listened intently, his young mind processing this new information. He had questions, of course, and Rebecca answered each one patiently, her voice filled with love and understanding. As the days went on, Rebecca made it her mission to help James feel connected to John. She took him to John's favorite park, where they fed ducks by the pond, just as John used to do. They visited the ice cream shop where Rebecca and John had their first date, sharing a sundae and giggling over the story. At home, Rebecca would pull out photo albums, pointing out pictures of John and sharing stories about each one. "This is your dad at the beach," she'd say, showing James a photo of John building a sandcastle. "He loved the ocean, just like you do." James soaked up every detail, his eyes wide with wonder as he learned about the father he'd never known. He began to ask more questions, eager to understand this part of his heritage. As they spent more time together, James started to open up to Rebecca. He shared his fears and dreams, trusting her with his innermost thoughts. Rebecca listened attentively, her heart swelling with pride and love for this remarkable boy who had become such an important part of her life. Rebecca held James's small hand tightly as they walked through the peaceful cemetery. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. James looked around curiously, his eyes wide as he took in the rows of headstones. "Are we almost there?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, sweetheart, just a little bit further." As they approached John's grave, Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She had visited this spot countless times, but never with James by her side. It felt different now, more meaningful. They stopped in front of the polished granite headstone. Rebecca knelt down, gently pulling James close to her side. "This is where your daddy rests, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. James stared at the stone, his eyes tracing the letters of John's name. Rebecca watched him, seeing the same thoughtful expression that John used to wear. "Hi, John," Rebecca began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've brought someone very special to meet you today." She squeezed James's shoulder gently. "This is James, our son. He's the most wonderful little boy, and he reminds me so much of you." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes as she continued. "He has your kind heart, John. And your eyes, those beautiful, soulful eyes that I fell in love with. I wish you could see him, could hold him in your arms." James listened intently, his gaze fixed on the headstone. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small toy car, a red convertible, just like the one John had owned. "Can I?" James asked hesitantly, looking up at Rebecca. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. James stepped forward and carefully placed the toy car at the base of the headstone. "This is for you, Dad," he said softly. "I hope you like it." Rebecca's heart swelled with love and pride. She pulled James into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. As they held each other, the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, as if John's spirit was embracing them both. As the seasons changed and James settled into his new life with Rebecca, their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Rebecca, inspired by James's presence, found renewed purpose in her charitable work. She decided to involve James in her visits to the orphanage, hoping to teach him the importance of giving back. On a crisp Saturday morning, Rebecca and James prepared for their first visit together. As they drove to the orphanage, Rebecca glanced at James in the rearview mirror. His eyes sparkled with excitement, reminding her so much of John's enthusiasm for helping others. "Are you ready to meet some new friends, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked warmly. James nodded eagerly. "Yes, Mama, I can't wait to play with them and share my toys." When they arrived, Ms. Rodriguez greeted them with a warm smile. "James, it's wonderful to see you again. And look how you've grown." James beamed, standing a little taller. "I brought some of my favorite books to read to the other kids," he said proudly, holding up a small backpack. As they entered the playroom, James hesitated for a moment, suddenly shy. Rebecca gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "It's okay, honey. Remember, you used to live here too. You can show these children that there's hope." Encouraged by Rebecca's words, James took a deep breath and stepped forward. He approached a group of children playing with blocks and asked if he could join them. Soon, his infectious laughter filled the room as he built towers and shared stories about his new life with Rebecca. Rebecca watched from across the room, her heart swelling with pride. She saw how James's eyes lit up when he helped a younger child with a puzzle, just as John's used to when he volunteered at the local shelter. James's kindness and patience shone through in every interaction. Later, as James read a story to a small group of children, Rebecca overheard him say, "I used to live here too, you know. But now I have a wonderful mama who loves me very much. Don't give up hope. Your family is out there waiting for you." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes as she listened to James's words. His compassion and empathy, so reminiscent of John's, touched her deeply. She realized that in helping James find a home, she had not only honored John's memory, but had also created a legacy of love and kindness that would continue to grow. As the holidays approached, Rebecca's family decided it was time to meet James. They had been hesitant about the adoption at first, worried about how Rebecca would manage as a single parent. But their curiosity and love for Rebecca finally overcame their doubts. On a chilly Sunday afternoon, Rebecca's parents, her sister Sarah and Sarah's husband Tom, arrived at Rebecca's home. James, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness, stood close to Rebecca as she opened the door. "Welcome, everyone," Rebecca said warmly, ushering them inside. "I'd like you to meet James." James looked up at the new faces, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Hello," he said softly, giving a small wave. Rebecca's mother, Linda, knelt down to James's level. "Hello, James. It's so nice to finally meet you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. As the family settled in the living room, James slowly began to open up. He showed them his favorite toys and books, proudly explaining how Rebecca had helped him arrange his new room. Rebecca's father, Robert, watched the interaction with growing admiration. He saw how James looked to Rebecca for reassurance, and how she responded with gentle encouragement. The bond between them was undeniable. "Rebecca," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have to admit, I was worried about this whole situation, but seeing you two together, it's clear that this was meant to be." Sarah nodded in agreement. "James is such a wonderful boy, Becca, and the way you are with him, it's like you've always been his mother." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes as she heard her family's words of support. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling James close to her side. "He's brought so much joy into my life." As the afternoon wore on, the initial awkwardness melted away. Tom taught James how to play a card game, while Sarah and Linda listened intently to James's stories about his life with Rebecca. At one point, Linda pulled Rebecca aside. "Sweetheart, I'm so proud of you," she said, squeezing Rebecca's hand. "John would be too. You've given this child a home and so much love." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "He's given me so much too, Mom. He's helped heal my heart in ways I never thought possible." As the visit came to an end, the family gathered around James. "Welcome to the family, James," Robert said, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "We're so happy you're here." James beamed, looking up at Rebecca with eyes full of love and belonging. In that moment, surrounded by her family's warmth and acceptance, Rebecca knew that James was exactly where he belonged. Rebecca and James arrived at the orphanage, their arms laden with festive decorations and gifts. The annual holiday event was in full swing, and the air buzzed with excitement. As they stepped through the doors, Ms. Rodriguez greeted them with a warm smile. "Rebecca, James, we're so glad you could make it," she said, giving James a gentle pat on the shoulder. James beamed up at Ms. Rodriguez. "We wouldn't miss it for anything," he replied, his eyes sparkling with joy. As they made their way into the main room, children of all ages rushed to greet them. Many of them remembered James from his time at the orphanage, and they were eager to hear about his new life. Rebecca watched with pride as James began to share his story. He spoke softly at first, but his confidence grew as the other children gathered around him. "I know how it feels to be here, wondering if you'll ever have a family," James said, his voice filled with empathy. "But I want you to know that families can come in ways you don't expect. Miss Rebecca found me, and now I have a home and a mom who loves me." The children listened intently, their faces a mix of hope and wonder. One little girl raised her hand timidly. "Did you ever think you'd find a family?" she asked. James shook his head. "I didn't, but I never stopped hoping, and now I have the best mom in the world." Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to James's words. She knelt down beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "And I have the most wonderful son," she added, her voice filled with emotion. As the event continued, Rebecca and James helped distribute gifts and decorate the Christmas tree. The room was filled with laughter and joy, the spirit of the season touching everyone present. Ms. Rodriguez approached Rebecca, her eyes misty. "What you and James have done today is incredible," she said softly. "You've given these children something precious. Hope." Rebecca nodded, watching as James played with a group of younger children. "We're just paying forward the love we've found in each other," she replied. As the months passed, Rebecca watched with pride as James blossomed in his new life. The shy, quiet boy she had first met at the orphanage was transforming before her eyes. One sunny afternoon, Rebecca sat on a park bench watching James play with his classmates. His laughter rang out across the playground, a sound that warmed her heart. She remembered a time when James would have been too timid to join in such games, but now he was right in the middle of the action. "Mom, did you see that?" James called out, waving excitedly after scoring a goal in their impromptu soccer game. Rebecca gave him a thumbs up, her smile as bright as the sun overhead. "Great job, sweetie," she cheered. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, James couldn't stop talking about his day at school. "And then in science class, we did this really cool experiment with plants," he explained, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "I got to be the group leader." Rebecca listened intently, marveling at how articulate and confident James had become. "That's wonderful, James," she said. "I'm so proud of you for taking on that responsibility." James beamed at her praise. "I couldn't have done it before," he admitted, "but now I feel like I can do anything." His words touched Rebecca deeply. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You can do anything, sweetheart. You're smart, kind, and brave." As she tucked James into bed that night, Rebecca reflected on how far they had come. The frightened little boy from the orphanage had grown into a happy, well-adjusted child. He had friends, excelled in his studies, and most importantly, he knew he was loved. Rebecca kissed James's forehead gently. "Good night, my sweet boy," she whispered. "Good night, Mom," James replied, snuggling into his blankets. "I love you." Those 3 simple words never failed to make Rebecca's heart swell with joy. As she closed his bedroom door, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the family they had created together. As the seasons changed, Rebecca and James began to create new traditions together, weaving a tapestry of memories that honored the past while embracing their future. One of the most significant traditions they established was celebrating John's birthday each year. On the morning of John's birthday, Rebecca woke up early to prepare a special breakfast. The smell of cinnamon and warm syrup filled the house as she made John's favorite pancakes. James bounded down the stairs, his eyes bright with excitement. "Is it time?" he asked eagerly. Rebecca nodded, smiling. "It's time. Want to help me set the table?" Together, they arranged plates and utensils, placing a framed photo of John at the center of the table. As they ate, Rebecca shared stories about John's love for pancakes and how he would always insist on adding extra chocolate chips. "Your dad had such a sweet tooth," she laughed, ruffling James's hair. Later that evening, they prepared John's favorite dinner, a hearty lasagna with garlic bread. As the dish baked in the oven, filling the house with delicious aromas, Rebecca and James sat in the living room, flipping through old photo albums. "Tell me more about Dad," James said, pointing to a picture of John at the beach. Rebecca's eyes softened as she recalled the memory. "Oh, that was our first vacation together. Your dad was determined to learn how to surf, but he kept falling off the board. He never gave up, though. That was one of the things I loved most about him, his persistence." James nodded, absorbing every detail. "I wish I could have known him," he said softly. Rebecca hugged him close. "He would have loved you so much, James. And in a way, you do know him. You have his kind heart and his determination." As they sat down to dinner, Rebecca raised her glass in a toast. "To John," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "A wonderful husband and a father who lives on in our hearts." "To Dad," James echoed, lifting his glass of milk. They spent the rest of the evening sharing more stories about John, laughing at his jokes and remembering his acts of kindness. Before bed, they looked at the stars from the backyard, something John had loved to do. This new tradition, blending the old with the new, helped James feel connected to the father he never met. It also strengthened the bond between him and Rebecca, creating a sense of continuity and belonging in his new life. Weeks later, Rebecca and James packed their bags with excitement, ready for their trip to the lakeside cabin that held so many precious memories for Rebecca and John. As they drove along winding roads, Rebecca's heart swelled with a mix of emotions: joy at sharing this special place with James, and a tinge of sadness that John couldn't be there with them. The cabin came into view, nestled among tall pines with the sparkling lake stretching out before it. James's eyes widened as he took in the serene scene. "Wow," he breathed. "It's beautiful here." Rebecca smiled, remembering her own first reaction to the place. "Your dad and I loved coming here. It was our little escape from the world." They settled into the cozy cabin, unpacking their belongings and exploring the familiar rooms. Rebecca showed James the porch swing where she and John would sit for hours, talking and watching the sunset. "Can we sit there?" James asked eagerly. "Of course," Rebecca replied, her voice warm with affection. As they swung gently, Rebecca pointed out across the lake. "See that island over there? Your dad once tried to swim to it. He made it halfway before realizing it was much farther than he thought." James giggled, imagining his father's adventure. "Did he make it back okay?" "Oh yes," Rebecca laughed. "But he was so tired, he fell asleep right here on this swing as soon as we got back." The next day they went fishing off the small dock. Rebecca showed James how to bait the hook and cast the line, just as John had taught her years ago. When James caught his first fish, a small perch, his face lit up with pride. "Dad would have loved this, wouldn't he?" James asked, carefully releasing the fish back into the water. Rebecca nodded, her eyes misty. "He would have been so proud of you, James." As the days passed, Rebecca and James created new memories alongside the old ones. They hiked the nearby trails, roasted marshmallows over a campfire, and spent quiet evenings playing board games that John had loved. The peaceful setting seemed to bring them even closer, their bond strengthening with each shared experience. James began to feel a deeper connection to the father he never knew, while Rebecca found comfort in sharing these cherished memories with her son. As summer faded into autumn, Rebecca and James prepared for their visit to the orphanage. This time, they weren't just visitors. They were a family, united by love and the memory of John. The familiar building came into view and James squeezed Rebecca's hand. "I'm excited to see everyone," he said, his eyes shining. Rebecca smiled warmly. "Me too, sweetheart, and I'm so proud of you for wanting to share our story." They entered the orphanage, arms laden with gifts for the children. Ms. Rodriguez greeted them with a warm hug. "Look at you two," she exclaimed. "You both look so happy." "Thank you for visiting us always. The children are happy seeing both of you." The children gathered around, their faces lighting up at the sight of James. He was no longer the quiet boy in the corner, but a confident, smiling child with a family of his own. Rebecca watched with pride as James began to hand out the gifts. He spoke softly to each child, sharing words of encouragement and hope. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as James continued talking to the children. "Don't give up hope. Your family might be out there, just waiting to find you." The children listened intently, their faces a mix of wonder and hope. Rebecca stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "Family isn't always what we expect," she added softly. "Sometimes it finds us in the most unexpected ways. But love is what makes a family, and there's always more love to go around." As they spoke with the children and staff, Rebecca felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. She realized that by opening her heart to James, she had not only given him the love and family he deserved, but had also found healing for herself. If you enjoyed the story of Rebecca and James, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.